We all have those days. You know the ones. You oversleep, you trip while getting dressed, coffee spills all over you, and then you're late to work because you had to change your shirt, and of course, you get in trouble for being late. By the end of a day like that, you only want to crawl back into bed and forget it ever happened. Now, imagine a day where it's not just coffee spills or stubbed toes. Imagine falling from impossible heights, getting run over by a train, or surviving a chainsaw to the neck. Some people face days so absurdly awful that they should be fatal, and yet somehow, it wasn't. I'm Mike with List 25, and here are 25 people who somehow survived freak accidents. 25. The Convertible Incident. Motorist James Crawford's brush with disaster in 2012 is the kind of story that's funny only because nobody got seriously hurt. While driving to work on the New Jersey Turnpike, James encountered something you don't typically see on the morning commute: a massive steel beam floating over the highway courtesy of a nearby construction crane. Before James could react, his van got an impromptu makeover. The beam sheared the entire roof off, leaving his vehicle looking like a convertible. Despite a few cuts and a broken thumb, James walked away remarkably unscathed and was out of the hospital by lunchtime and back at work the next week. 24. The Man with Half a Head. Let me clear this up right away. No, this is not Photoshop. Carlos Rodriguez, known to some as Halfy, earned his nickname after a devastating car accident left him with what can only be described as half a head. And that's not just internet talk. A police report about an unrelated incident later described him using the exact words, half a head. The accident happened when a 14-year-old Carlos drove under the influence of drugs and alcohol, lost control, and slammed into a pole. He was ejected through the windshield, and the upper portion of his skull didn't survive the crash. Miraculously, Carlos did. 23. Feathers and Fractures. In 2010, Matthew Brealey's motorcycle ride near his Chesterfield home turned into a freak accident he'd never forget. Traveling at 80 kilometers or 50 miles an hour, Matthew's visor was shattered by a low-flying pigeon which hit him squarely in the face. The bird died instantly, and the impact knocked Matthew unconscious. Slumped forward, Matthew's body hit the throttle, sending his bike hurtling to 225 kilometers or 140 miles an hour before it ricocheted off an oak tree. Ejected onto the road, Matthew suffered serious injuries, including a broken leg requiring a titanium pin and 2 skull fractures. 22. The Unfortunate Skydiver. Christy McKenzie was on her 112th jump in 2004 when things went horribly wrong. Attempting a sitting position jump for the first time, Christine built up incredible speed before deploying her parachute at 6,000 feet, or 1,828 meters. And then, her main chute failed to open. Christine quickly deployed her reserve parachute, but the two became tangled, sending her spiraling out of control. She braced for impact, only to crash into live power lines, a stroke of bad luck that likely saved her life. The wires broke her fall, leaving her with a broken pelvis and severe bruising. 21. The Girl Who Survived. In 2009, Yemenia Flight 626 crashed into the Indian Ocean at 2 a.m., killing 152 people. 12-year-old Bahia Bakari was the sole survivor. Ejected from the plane during the crash, she clung to a piece of debris despite not being a strong swimmer and having no life jacket. After 9 horrifying hours adrift, a civilian vessel found her floating amidst the wreckage. Bahia suffered a fractured pelvis and collarbone, but was released from the hospital just 3 weeks later. 20. The Women Who Survived Impossible Falls. These survival stories of Julian Kopke and Vesna Vulovic are nothing short of extraordinary. In 1971, the 17-year-old Julianne fell 10,000 feet into the Amazon jungle after her plane was struck by lightning. Her seat cushioned the impact, and she survived with minor injuries, trekking through the jungle for 11 days before being rescued. A year later, Vesna Vulovic survived a record-breaking fall of 33,000 feet after her plane exploded mid-air over Czechoslovakia. The flight attendant endured a fractured skull and broken legs, but became the sole survivor of the disaster. 19. The Ultimate Survivor. Violet Jessup is the only woman on this list to survive multiple shipwrecks. Born to Irish immigrants in Argentina, she moved to England after her father's death and followed her mother into stewardess work with the White Star Line. Her first disaster came in 1911 when the RMS Olympic collided with the HMS Hawke. A year later, she joined the Titanic's maiden voyage and escaped its sinking in a lifeboat. Then, in 1916, while serving as a nurse on the HMS Britannic, she survived again after the ship struck a mine. She died in 1971 at the age of 83. 18. Texas's luckiest rodeo clown. In 2013, Casey Wagner, a rodeo clown in St. Joe, Texas, experienced one of the rarest freak accidents imaginable. Taking shelter under a tree during a lightning storm, well, you can guess what happened, but you'd actually only be 50% right. Casey saw sparks flying and realized what was coming. A lightning bolt struck him, knocking him to the ground. But before he could fully process what had happened, he got hit by a second bolt. Despite the odds of surviving 2 consecutive strikes, Casey walked away with no major injuries. 17. The man who got hit 7 times. How can I not follow that story with this one? Roy Sullivan, a Shenandoah National Park ranger in Virginia, holds the Guinness World Record for surviving the most lightning strikes. 7 in total. Nicknamed the Spark Ranger, Roy's unlucky streak began in 1942 when he lost a toenail. The strikes kept coming in 1969, 70, 72, 73, 76, and 77, leaving him with burns, chest injuries, and a twice-scorched head of hair. 16. The scientist who survived a proton beam. Anatoly Bugorsky might just be the luckiest scientist ever. In 1978, while repairing the synchrotron U-70 particle accelerator, Bugorsky accidentally stuck his head directly into the path of a proton beam. The beam, packing 2,000 grays of radiation, enough to obliterate a human in normal circumstances, burned a hole through his brain and exited near his nose at 3,000 grays. The accident left him partially paralyzed and deaf in one ear. Amazingly, Bugorsky went on to earn a PhD and is still alive today. 15. Yasser Lopez's Speargun miracle. Surviving a proton beam is one thing, but a fishing spear through the skull? That takes survival to a whole new level. During a sunny Miami fishing trip, 16-year-old Yasser Lopez had a freak accident with a gas-powered spear gun when the weapon sent a 1 meter or 3-foot spear straight through his forehead. Incredibly, Yasser stayed conscious even after he arrived at the hospital. Doctors found the spear tip lodged against the back of his head. While Yasser was suffering from memory loss and motor difficulties after the ordeal, he made a remarkable recovery. 14. Michael Cassidy's motorcycle crash. Michael Cassidy survived a motorcycle crash so severe it nearly tore him in half. After losing control and slamming into a hidden fire hydrant, the impact violently split his pelvis in what's known as an open book fracture. Trust me, do not Google it. It is an injury most people wouldn't survive. Luckily for him, off-duty nurses rushed to his aid, and at the hospital, doctors turned to a cutting-edge procedure, using a balloon catheter to halt the catastrophic blood loss and buy time for life-saving surgery. After a month of operations and rehab, Michael defied the odds and even later became a dad. 13. Melbourne's miracle baby. One of the most miraculous survival stories ever caught on CCTV unfolded in Melbourne, Australia in October 2009. A 6-month-old baby was struck by a train and survived. The baby, seated in the stroller, was positioned just a little too close to the edge of the tracks. As his mother glanced away for a brief moment, the stroller rolled into the path of an oncoming train. Despite the driver slamming on the brakes, the train carried the stroller 30 meters or 98 feet along the tracks before coming to a stop. Incredibly, the baby survived with nothing more than a bump on the head. 12. The man who survived 3 days underwater. Harrison O'Kenney became trapped in a tugboat in 2013 after rough seas capsized the vessel, sinking at 30 meters or 98 feet to the ocean floor. 11 of his crewmates didn't make it. O'Kenney was the sole survivor. He survived by staying in an air pocket and built a platform to keep his torso above water, slowing hypothermia as he waited nearly 3 days for rescue. Divers finally rescued O'Kenney, who made a full recovery, and against all odds, became a certified commercial diver just 2 years later. 11. The window washer who fell 47 stories. In December 2007, Alcides Moreno and his brother Edgar were washing windows on a Manhattan high-rise when their platform detached and plunged 47 stories, almost 500 feet, into an alleyway. Edgar did not survive the fall, but firefighters found Alcides alive, conscious, and even sitting up. Investigators believe Alcides managed to ride the platform, which slowed his fall just enough to save his life. He somehow avoided the head and pelvic injuries that are usually fatal in such falls, but still suffered brain trauma, shattered limbs, fractured ribs, and more. 10. The man who climbed out of a volcano. Can you imagine surviving a fall into lava? Well, in 2007, a Maasai porter did exactly that after he slipped and ended up in Oldonyo Lenge, an active volcano in Tanzania aptly named the Mountain of God. His arms and legs were severely burned, but he somehow managed to climb out by using his pack as a platform. His survival came down to Oldonyo Lenge's unusual lava. At 510 degrees Celsius or 950 Fahrenheit, it's far less volatile and blisteringly hot than the lava we usually imagine, and made his miraculous escape possible. 9. Trapped in a cloud. Getting sucked into a cloud doesn't sound deadly, until it happens to you. In 2007, German paraglider Eva Wisniewska was training for the Paragliding World Championships in Australia when she encountered the storm of a lifetime. Despite trying to avoid the storm clouds, an updraft grabbed her glider and shot her upwards at 20 meters or 66 feet per second. She was blinded by ice, pummeled by hail, and fighting turbulence, lightning, and freezing cold. At 10,000 meters or 32,800 feet, higher than Mount Everest, she lost consciousness for 40 minutes. Incredibly, the ice surrounding her body slowed her metabolism and insulated her just enough to survive the lack of oxygen. A downdraft eventually pulled her glider toward the ground, and she managed to land safely on a farm where rescuers found her. 8. Headlocked by the cold. For Paul Lessard, a solo snowmobiling trip in Maine turned into a nightmare of survival. After flipping his snowmobile, Paul's head became pinned underneath the heavy storage rack. Moving risked breaking his neck, but staying put meant enduring freezing temperatures. Almost his body lay submerged in an icy creek. As night fell, the temperature plummeted to 0, and search crews were forced to pause overnight due to heavy snow and wind. After more than 20 hours trapped, Paul was finally rescued when a local Arctic cat dealer and his son spotted the overturned snowmobile. Apart from a bit of hypothermia and frostbite, he recovered just fine. 7. The day the toilet fought back. Michelle Pierre of New York City had the kind of unfortunate freak accident most of us never want to imagine. After maintenance turned the water back on, Michelle decided to test the toilet, and got far more than he'd bargained for. Instead of flushing, his toilet exploded, blasting shards of porcelain shrapnel everywhere. Michelle needed 30 stitches, and now flushes using a rope from behind a door. Amazingly, Michelle's toilet wasn't the only casualty. 3 others in the building also exploded when the water returned. He just had the misfortune of being there for the, fireworks. 6. Bear Grylls brush with death. Fair warning. If the last few entries had you squirming, then things are not about to get any easier. On the bright side, the last few entries check both the boxes of really messed up and guys with awesome names, so there's that. Before Bear Grylls became a household name in survival TV, he had a terrifying brush with death in 1996. At just 21, Bear leaped from a plane over Zambia while training with the UK's elite 21 SAS regiment. At 16,000 feet, or 4,877 meters, his parachute failed to open, sending him into a violent spin with no time to deploy his reserve chute. He crash-landed on his back, fracturing his spine in 3 places. Yet, in true Bear Grylls fashion, he didn't just recover. 2 years later, he climbed Mount Everest. 5. Phineas Gage. If a proton beam and a fishing spear through the head weren't shocking enough, well, let me talk about Phineas Gage, the OG of catastrophic head injuries. In 1848, while working on a railroad in Cavendish, Vermont, Gage used explosives to clear rocks when disaster struck. A tamping iron shot through his cheek, passed behind his left eye, and exited the top of his skull. The rod obliterated much of his frontal lobe, the brain center for personality and behavior. Those who knew Gage said he was never the same again, but he continued to live for another 12 years before a seizure tied to his injury finally claimed his life. 4. The pilot who defied gravity. On June 10, 1990, one of British Airways Flight 5390's cockpit windscreen panels separated from the fuselage. The decompression was so violent that 42-year-old Captain Tim Lancaster was ripped from his seat and sucked halfway out the aircraft. Luckily for Lancaster, his legs became wedged behind the flight controls, preventing him from being fully ejected. With his body exposed to freezing winds and his head repeatedly striking the plane's fuselage, stewards took turns holding on to him. Their efforts saved his life. When the plane landed, Lancaster was alive, suffering only bruises, fractures, and frostbite. 3. Trapped by a boulder. We've all seen the movie, and if you haven't, you should definitely watch it, but only if you've got a strong stomach. Aaron Ralston's story is the stuff of nightmares and legends. In 2003, during a solo climb in the remote canyons of Utah, a 360 kilogram or 800 pound boulder shifted and pinned his arm, effectively trapping him. Aaron waited for rescuers for days, snapping photos as his hope faded. When it became clear no one was coming, he made the unthinkable decision to amputate his own arm. And I will spare you the details. Aaron not only survived his ordeal, he thrived. Today, he's a motivational speaker, and he's still climbing mountains. 2. The survivor on the tracks. In 2006, Texan Truman Duncan, see, I told you about the names, had the worst day of his life. While riding in the front of a train car, he slipped and fell onto the tracks. Despite backpedaling desperately, he couldn't outrun the train's wheels, which caught his feet and pulled him under. By the time the train stopped, 23 meters or 75 feet later, Truman's lower body was obliterated. He somehow stayed alive and conscious, called 911, and waited 45 minutes for paramedics to arrive. Truman had 23 surgeries over 4 months and not only survived, but continues to live a full life. 1. The chainsaw survivor. Finally, we have the incredible story of 74-year-old chainsaw enthusiast Forthman Murph. While cutting trees alone in the woods, an activity I do not recommend, Forthman experienced a series of freak accidents that could have been scripted by Murphy's Law. A tree he cut pulled down a branch, which struck him and sent him tumbling into a ditch. As if that wasn't bad enough, the falling tree knocked over another, which crushed his leg and pinned him in place. Then came the main event. Forthman had fallen on his still-running chainsaw, which was slicing through his neck. Instead of panicking, Forthman got mad. Holding his nearly severed neck together, he staggered to his truck, stopping occasionally to let the blood drain so he wouldn't drown. With his esophagus, windpipe, and nearly everything but his arteries and spine severed, he somehow drove himself half a mile to a neighbor's house. After being rushed to a hospital, Forthman faced infections from sawdust but eventually recovered. For years after the accident, Forthman loved to talk about his 3 great loves: music, Jesus, and chainsaws, because the man simply didn't hold grudges. And that is a wrap. But before you go, here's a little trivia. Remember Anatoly Bugorsky, the scientist who survived sticking his head into a proton beam? He survived being hit by a massive dose of radiation. But do you remember how powerful it was? A. 500 grays, B. 2,000 grays, C. 5,000 grays, or D. 10,000 grays? Drop your answers in the comments below. And if you thought these stories were intense, you don't want to miss our related video, 25 inventions that killed their own inventors. It is full of real-life examples of how groundbreaking ideas can have fatal outcomes. As always, thank you for watching, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.